email transport security, especially about, about two efforts inside the IETF to make the situation a little bit better than that is today. So first we start with a small recap on the problem with mail transport security, and then we look at two different solutions to the problems. First is the MTA strict transport security, which is currently a draft inside the IETF, which means it's an internet standard in development. And the second one is the SMTP-DANE RFC. And at the end, we look at SMTP TLS reporting, which is also a new draft inside the IETF that works with either the strict transport security or with DANE, and that is about reporting any errors with the encryption between mail servers. Now, Men&Mice is a DNS company, and so why do we do all this email stuff? Because it is rooted in DNS. Both solutions, all three solutions that we present here, work with the DNS. So a DNS administrator should be aware of what's coming in maybe the next months or years. So if the email administrator comes along and asks you, hey, can you put this in this record in your DNS for me to make my email more secure? You can say, yes, I can. Maybe I already have done. So let's have a look at the problem of email transport security. So we discussed this on a previous webinar before. That was the webinar on DNSSEC and DANE email security reloaded, and you see the link here on the page. So if you want to have the details, you can rewatch that webinar. It's online on YouTube and also on the Men&Mice website. So we just have a short recap here. What's the problem? Now, we have two kinds of encrypted protocols on the internet. One is a protocol that uses a dedicated port and a dedicated URI for encrypted communication, like HTTP. On HTTP, connections are made on port 80 unencrypted and on port 443 encrypted. So everyone knows, like every browser and every web server knows, if there is a connection on port 443, it is supposed to be encrypted. And if there's no encryption available on the other side, that's a plain error. On the other side, everything on port 80 is unencrypted. And presenting an encrypted stream there is the same error. We don't have that in email, because email uses in-protocol signaling to bootstrap the encryption. There's no dedicated port. And that signaling is insecure and can be intercepted. So what happens when two email servers talk to each other? They open port 25, the SMTP port, unencrypted. So the sending mail server is on the left and the receiving is on the right. The receiving mail server then greets the sending mail server that made the connection. The sending mail server sends back a greeting. The receiving mail server sends a feature list, and that feature list includes information whether that server supports encryption at all. And if it supports encryption, then the sending side requests the encryption, which is still unencrypted communication, and then a greeting happened again, which is the same greeting in step number 2, but this time it's over encrypted TLS secured channel. Now the problem here is that all the red ones, all the unencrypted communication can be intercepted, and anyone sitting in the middle of that communication can just strip out certain commands, like the commands to request encryption. And that will force the communication between these two servers to be unencrypted. And that happens quite often. There are ISPs that do that. There are devices, antivirus devices that do that. There's even governments that do that on their state-run firewall. So the core problem of that weakness in email security is that the receiving side has no means to communicate an encryption policy. The receiving side has no means to say, I use encryption, and if my server pretends not to support encryption, that's wrong. And the sending side cannot infer the encryption policy because there's no dedicated port it needs to guess whether encryption is, or it needs to ask whether encryption is available. So two solutions are available or worked on in the IETF. The first one that we will look at is MTA Strict Transport Security, MTA-STS, and the second one is DANE. So first, have a look on the draft about MTA Strict Transport Security. And here, a TXT record is placed in DNS, and that TXT record signals to the sending side that the receiving mail server wants to do encryption. And in addition to the TXT record in DNS, there is a JSON document stored on a secured web server, which is or must be secured with transport layer security. And that JSON document explains further the policy under which encryption is available for these servers. The administrator that wants to make use of MTA-STS will publish a TXT record, and that must live on a well-known subdomain _MTA-STS, and then the email domain at the end. So for the domain example.com, it would be _MTA-STS.example.com. And we see here the example on the bottom of the slide. That TXT record contains 2 bits of information. First is the MTA-STS version number, which is currently only version 1 because it's the only version being defined. And then there is the encryption policy ID. And that is being used so that the policy can be switched over or can be changed just by updating the TXT record. And that gives a lot of flexibility to the administrator. Every time what we will see is that mail servers will cache the policy information, and every time the policy times out from the cache or in between, a mail server can just quickly ask via DNS whether the policy has been changed by comparing the encryption policy version number, the ID number, with whatever is stored in the cache. For MTA-STS, DNSSEC is recommended but not required. So some people see that as the big benefit of this approach, because you don't need to go through the loops of setting up DNSSEC in your environment. Now, in addition to publish the TXT record, the administrator will also publish a JSON document. JSON is JavaScript object notation, and that's a way to store structured data on in a document. And here it's on a web page, and it will be stored on a web server that must be HTTPS secured with a certificate that can be validated through a root certificate, like the root certificates that are usually coming with web browsers. And it must be on a well-known subdomain called MTA-STS, no underscore here. So unlike the TXT record, this name is actually a host name, and an underscore is not allowed in a host name. So we have just MTA-STS here, and then example.com /well-known/MTA-STS.json. That is the full path to the document. And that document then contains additional information, like, again, the version number of the STS protocol being used, whether the sending side should enforce the policy or just report violations of the policy. Then the MX field, which contains the name that will appear in the certificate that is stored on the mail server receiving. And that can be either a full qualified name or the right-hand side part of a domain name. Like here, when a name starts with a dot, like mail.example.com, that means it's a wildcard, meaning that the name must end in mail.example.com, but can have any labels in front of it. And then we have a max age field, which is the permitted lifetime of this policy in seconds. So here we have a view on how MTA-STS is being used by the mail and DNS infrastructure. So we have a mail client on the left-hand side, and that is the sending domain. A mail client, a sending mail transfer agent, which is a fancy name for a mail server. And then we have a DNS or DNSSEC resolver on the sending domain. On the receiving side, we have the policy web server that serves the JSON document. We have the receiving MTA, and we have an authoritative DNS server. And in between, we have the wily internet. Now, a user wants to send an email, and he composes or she composes the email via an email tool called a mail user agent, and that mail user agent sends the email to the sending mail server. Now that mail server understands MTA-STS protocol, so it checks first its policy cache, whether it knows if the receiving mail server does encryption or not. And if it has either no information, or the policy is expired, or if it hasn't checked the policy for a longer time and wants to recheck, it then asks for a TXT record. So that request goes out to the resolver, goes out to the authoritative server, the TXT record comes back if it exists, and is being sent to the mail server. Now the mail server knows that there is a policy, but it doesn't know the content of the policy, because the policy itself is stored on the web server. Now it will request the JSON policy from the web server, and this is an HTTPS request. And the policy document comes back, and it needs to be verified. So the certificate being used on the policy web server must match any, or must have a proper signature of any of the root CAs stored on the sending MTA on the mail server. And if the certificate is good, everything looks fine, nothing fishy, then the policy is being stored in the cache in the mail server, and the mail is being delivered. It's delivered to port 25, just like normal email, and the STARTTLS MTP session is being used to encrypt it. Now, if the receiving mail server on the right-hand side is now pretending not to support encryption, then this email will not be delivered, because the policy explicitly states that the receiving side will do encryption. The certificate comes back from the receiving MTA, and now the name that is being used in the certificate is being checked against the policy. So the name that is in the certificate must appear in the MX field of the policy JSON document. And also the usual checks are done for X509 certificates, namely it is checking that the trust chain to a root CA is there, that the certificate is not expired, and that it adheres to certain security best practices, like not using SHA-1 hashes anymore, for example. And then mail is being delivered. Now let's compare that with DANE. DANE is the SMTP security via opportunistic DNS-based authentication of named entities transport layer security, RC 7672. Now that's the mouthful. What does it do? While MTA-STS is transporting the policy via a web server and a JSON document, SMTP with DANE signals the policy via DNS alone. So there's no need to have a web server. The TLSA record is being used for that, and it either holds the full certificate or a hash of the certificate, which then can be verified against the certificate being presented by the receiving mail server. MTA-DANE is already standardized. It has been standardized in October 2015. So it's with us already 2 years. Now, how does MTA-DANE work? The mail is delivered again to the mail server. And here, with MTA-DANE, we don't have an explicit policy cache. What we could have is a cached TLSA record on the DNSSEC resolver, but that cache is in the DNS and not in the mail server. So the mail server is a little bit simpler in this case. The MTA requests the TLSA record. The request goes out to the DNSSEC validating resolver. That checks its cache. If it's not in the cache, it will do iterative resolution going to the authoritative DNS server. And it's asking in this case for _25, which is a port number, _TCP, which is the transport protocol for SMTP for email, and then the name of the receiving mail server, which is in this case mail01.example.com, asking for a TLSA record. And the authoritative DNS server here happens to have such a record and returns it back with the parameters of 311, meaning it's an end node certificate, not an intermediate certificate, and it's a hash, made with SHA-256 of that certificate. That response from the authoritative DNS server is validated by DNSSEC, and that's a must. It's a requirement with MTA-DANE that all the DNS holding the TLSA records must be DNSSEC secured and must validate properly. In this case, all works fine. DNSSEC validation is good. AD flag is being sent to the MTA, and now the sending mail server starts the mail connection, the SMTP connection to the receiving mail server. Receiving mail server responds with the certificate, and that is being validated against the certificate or the hash that was part of the TLSA record being received from DNS. And if both match, then email is being delivered. So we see it's similar to MTA-STS, but there are some important differences. We will look at the differences in a moment, but first I would like to tell you what happened since we had the webinar 2 years ago. There was in end of March this year that CloudMark, a large provider of security solutions for the email market, announced that their upcoming release 5.2 will support MTA-DANE, that is SMTP with DANE security. Now, CloudMark has about 12% global market share according to Wikipedia and 20% of the mobile market share in the email business. So that's quite a chunk of email accounts that will be able to use SMTP DANE. Then last year, early last year, two large mail providers in Germany, Web.de and PKIX, both belonging to 1&1 company, started to support MTA-DANE, and both together have over 50% market share. So in Germany, we can say now that MTA-DANE is being used by more than 50% of all email exchanges that are done inside the country. And the Dutch government now requests MTA-DANE from government agencies. They have a what's called a comply or explain list, meaning that government agency either must comply by implementing SMTP-DANE, or they must explain why it's not possible for them to do so. And lastly, the German Federal Office of Information Security, BSI, they require MTA-DANE for secure email for their secure email certification, which resulted in quite a number of email providers in Germany to implement SMTP with DANE. So comparing both protocols, with the strict transport security, we don't require DNSSEC, which is maybe for some people a big plus. not for me, because I really believe that DNSSEC is the way to go, and have told you so in many webinars before. But even with MTA-STS, while DNSSEC is not required, it's still recommended, because without DNSSEC there's still the possibility, for example, that someone is forging the TXT record that leads to the policy. For example, someone could replay an older TXT record with an older policy number, tricking the sending mail server to use an older policy. On the plus point is that MTA-STS defines a policy cache. So a mail server, especially a busy mail server, does not need to do DNS lookups for the policy for every mail. Instead, it can have a local database with policy entries that have already been fetched in the past, and they can look there. MTA-STS requires certificates that validate against a root CA certificate. So it's not possible to use MTA-STS with self-signed certificates, because if you communicate over the internet, then the other side, the sending side, will probably not have your own CA in their certificate store. MTA-STS requires a little bit more machines, because it requires this HTTPS server that serves the policy as a JSON document, and the mail server requires validation of HTTPS, which is more complexity on the mail server side. On the other hand, if we look at MTA-DANE, it does require DNSSEC. It doesn't work without, so that is a big showstopper for some people who don't want to jump on the DNSSEC bandwagon. It has no policy cache, but the time to live on the TLSA record can work a little bit like a policy cache, because then the policy which is transported with the TLSA record is being cached on the resolver inside the sending organization. It allows self-signed certificate. It even promotes that. And you can even work with certificates that are expired, because with MTA-DANE, all that is required is that the certificate matches the TLSA record. Even if the certificate is expired, expiry values, the fields will not be validated or will not be checked in MTA-DANE. As long as the TLSA record is in DNS and matches the certificate, everything is good. The policy can be changed by switching just the TLSA records in DNS. With MTA-STS, you need to change the JSON document plus the TXT record. They need to match with the IDs. On the downside is that TLS cert rollover need to be in sync with the TLSA records. With STS, that's not required, because all that STS is storing is the name of the mail servers in the certificate, but not a hash of the certificate. So it's independent of the certificates that is really stored there. And MTA-DANE relies on the trust on the DNSSEC chain, while STS relies on the trust of the certification authorities. And that is now a matter of which one you trust. Either the certification authority system or the DNS system. Both have their weaknesses. What I see, unfortunately, is that probably we have to implement both, because there will be the larger mail companies that are behind MTA-STS, namely Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, Comcast. They will use MTA-STS on their systems, and they have such a market share that you have to play by their rules. And a lot of others will use MTA-DANE, especially here in Europe. And so we have to use both and have to implement both. Now we have a look at SMTP TLS reporting, which is a way to report issues with email encryption, and that works both with strict transport security and DANE. the sending mail transport agent can report issues with encryption, and these issues can include man-in-the-middle attacks like a certification mismatch, expired certificates with strict transport security, or the server is not answering at all, or certificate not validating against the root CA, and many, many more. This protocol also requires a TXT record, and the TXT record is stored at a well-known subdomain called _SMTP-TLS RPT for TLS report, and it can either have a mail address or a URL there. And when the sending mail server detects an issue with encryption when sending mail, and the TXT record then contains a mail address, it will send the report to that mail address. Optionally, that report can be compressed. That mail must be delivered even in the situation where encryption is not available or is broken. As an option to sending by mail, the report can also be posted via an HTTPS post to a web server. And that web server then needs to read the report from the post and store that maybe in some database and create some reports, aggregated reports out of that. So here we show how the TLS reporting is being done. Again, a user wants to send an email, and we already did the dance of DANE or strict transport security, and now the STARTTLS SMTP session, the encrypted SMTP session, is being initiated, and the receiving MTA presents a certificate, and that certificate fails to validate, either because it's a different certificate that than that in the TLSA record, or in case of strict transport security, it doesn't validate against the root CA, or it's expired, or something else. Now in this case, the MTA requests the TXT record for the TLS report. Request goes out to the resolver, and that goes out to the authoritative server for the receiving domain, asking for _SMTP-TLS report.example.com text record. The answer comes back here in this case with a mail address that is being validated if it is DNS secured, but that's not mandatory, and that goes back to the MTA, and that MTA then delivers the report. Maybe over the same channel, but when delivering the report, encryption is not required, especially written in the draft that that email should be delivered by all means possible. Here we have an example how such a report looks like. This is a report that is either being posted or sent by email. We have the reporting company or organization that is creating this report. We have a report time range, because reports shouldn't be created for every failing mail, because it could be a large number of mails, and it could be a denial of service attack on its own. Instead, it is recommended to send reports in 24-hour intervals. Now, this is a report for the 1st of April last year, 2016. And we have a contact info for the mail server of this of the sending domain of this mail server. We have information about the policy that is being applied, and that applies to all the failures that are listed below. Then we have a summary report of how many successes we had delivering encrypted emails to this domain and how many failures we had, and then we have a list of all the failures. Here we have, for example, certificate expired failures with the mx1.mail.company.y.com, and we have 100 sessions that are failing, and we have on the end we have STARTTLS not supported with a different mail server with the mx2mail.company.y.com, and that means that the policy indicates encryption, but the server pretends not to support encryption at all. So this was the overview of SMTP TLS reporting. Before we start with the question and answer session, a few information about the upcoming trainings and webinars from Men&Mice. We have an Introduction DNS and Bind hands-on training in Zurich, which we have new in the list. That will be in September 18th to 20th, and after these days we have then the 2-day advanced training at the same location. That will be held at Switch in Zurich, which is the top-level domain registry for Switzerland. And we have 2 trainings listed in German language in Essen in the Linux Hotel, which is the 5-day DNS and Bind. And then we have the DNSSEC and DANE in German language in December, which especially the DNSSEC and DANE will cover all the email security stuff that we had in this webinar in much more depth, with practical exams and a lab environment where we can test out how to securely send email between each other. Now, our next webinar will be on the Certification Authority Authorization Record, or CAA record, which is a record that will be or is already useful if you use X5599 certificates for any of your communication services, if you use HTTPS on your web servers or on your mail servers, or for any other communication means on the internet, because starting from September 2017, the issuing certification authorities must support the CAA record. Now, what is the CAA record? In short, it pins or it signals which certification authority is allowed to issue certifications for a given domain. So it's a record in the DNS, and because it's becoming mandatory to support in September this year, we will talk about how this record works, why it's useful, and what you need to do in order to get certificates after September in this year. That webinar will be on Thursday, May 18th, same time as today. We currently don't have the sign-up page open. Watch the Men&Mice website with the webinar page, and it will appear shortly after Easter. So that concludes my webinar for today, and now we have some time for questions and hopefully answers.
Yes, Carson, we've got a good question. So MTA-STS seems like it might slow down the process of mail delivery substantially, and might not, excuse me, and might not be appropriate for an enterprise handling hundreds of thousands of mails per workday. What do you hear from the field?
Now, MTA-STS is brought forward by the largest mail providers in the world, namely Google Mail, Microsoft, Yahoo, and because MTA-STS is working with the policy cache, it's not required to fetch the JSON policy every time or fetch the TXT record every time. So first, fetching the TXT record and the JSON document can be done in parallel to the normal handshake, and it's done first time the mail server makes a connection to a new counterpart on the other side. Now, a lot of mail is being exchanged between the big players. Probably 60 to 70% of all mail goes between these big players. So once they have their machines in the cache, no further lookups are really needed. And it's recommended by the draft that the policy caching time, the lifetime of that policy, is in the weeks, not in the hours or days. It should be weeks or even months that policy is being valid. So once the policy is downloaded in the local cache, it shouldn't slow down the process of mail delivery in any way, because then it's just a lookup at some database, and that is what these big mail servers do anyway. Hope that answers the question.
And does anybody else, any of our attendees, have any questions or any follow-ups to that? I want to remind everybody, if anybody does have any follow-ups after maybe reviewing the video of this webinar, you can feel free to email either Carsten or myself with any questions, and we can follow up on those.
And please, a reminder that the MTA-STS is still a draft, so it's still work in progress. The links to the documents are in this webinar, and you all are welcome to read the document and to participate in the IETF way of working on the standards. So everyone can send in remarks and comments. That's why it's called request for comments. And if you see some roadblocks, showstoppers, bad ideas, sign up to the mailing list and raise your voice there.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Again, this will be recorded. You will receive a link when it goes live, which should be, I would imagine, in a couple of days.
Yeah, we now have Easter holidays, and give us some time after Easter.
So again, thanks everybody for attending.
Have a good Easter holiday. Bye-bye.